Joined by Joseph Moreno, a former federal prosecutor and former special assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. Paula, I want to begin with you on this latest indictment. Tell me a little bit more about the arguments made by both the prosecutor and by Manafort before Judge Amy Berman Jackson.
Well, let's start out with what just happened in Manhattan. That is a message to the president here at the White House, saying, look, Manafort is now expected to spend about 7.5 years in jail. But if he receives a presidential pardon, it's clear the Manhattan DA, he is sending a message that there is another case waiting to put Manafort behind bars. Now, today in court, prosecutors argued that Manafort's conduct tried to undermine the criminal justice system in the U.S. They said this is a man who not only lied about his work overseas, so here he is representing a foreign government and not disclosing that to other policy stakeholders. But this is a man who lied to the FBI. He lied to investigators, and they didn't pull any punches when they argued that his conduct attempted to undermine the U.S. political process. But his lawyers, Rena, his lawyers argue that, look, he pleaded guilty, he is sorry, he has admitted what he's done, and that they asked the judge for leniency. And it appears she went a little bit harder on him than I think his lawyers would have liked, but this sentence does seem to reflect the guidelines that she had to work in.
Joseph, I want to ask you, get your reaction to Manafort's sentencing, especially after last week's judge, Judge Elias, gave a sentencing of 4 years, which was much less than the guidelines that was presented by the special counsel's office.
Rena, I was surprised last week. I thought the sentence from Judge Ellis was years lower than what I was expecting. I was thinking it would be low double digits, and he came in at, 4 to 5 years. But today seems to make a lot of sense. I mean, Judge Jackson, right off the bat this morning, reportedly said, we are not here to revisit what happened in Virginia last week. I'm looking at this case in isolation with respect to the wrongdoing that Paul Manafort has been convicted of, and I'm going to make a sentence based on that. And with what she had to work with, I think Paul is absolutely right. With the way she came in and then made the sentences run consecutively with a little overlap in between comes to about the end result that many of us predicted. So if my math is correct, when you take into account there's no parole, but there is some time for good behavior, assuming Paul Manafort gets that, he will get minus time served out of prison in about November of 2024.
Paula, I want to ask you, Joseph is mentioning he'll be out by 2024. When will he begin serving time, and do you think he'll end up serving it concurrently?
Well, he's already incarcerated, so he will just continue to serve his sentence. He is getting some credit for the time that he has already served, but the way the judge did this, it's some complicated math. Some of his sentence overlaps, some of it does not, which is why, as he just noted, his sentence will likely end in about 6 years. Once you do all this fancy tap work and toe tapping and math here, it is very complicated, but some of the sentence is going to overlap. The big question is, where will he serve this term? He has asked for a facility that has minimum security, but also the kind of medical care that he needs for his current medical conditions. But sometimes it can be hard to find facilities that are not super secure and also provide that kind of medical care.
Joseph, we saw a very different Manafort compared to his sentencing last week. We know the president has not ruled out a pardon for him. And the last week, we know President Trump expressed sympathy for his former campaign chairman after his sentencing. I want to play you a bite from the president.
I feel very badly for Paul Manafort. I think it's been a very, very tough time for him. But if you notice, both his lawyer, a highly respected man, and a very highly respected judge, the judge said there was no collusion with Russia. It's had nothing to do with collusion. There was no collusion. It's a collusion hoax. It's a collusion witch hoax. I don't collude with Russia.
So do you think, Joseph, could Manafort's new sort of apologetic tone be playing to the president and also the court of public opinion for a pardon?
Well, I think he did get some sympathy from both judges and probably even from the general public in terms of his health and his age. I think it's hard to sort of put that side of your humanity aside, regardless of what a person has been convicted of. But as far as making these entreaties to the president and remaining defiant and the president picking up on the no collusion aspect of things, I think that at this point, politically, it would be extremely difficult for President Trump to issue a pardon to Paul Manafort. And then, of course, there's the practical ramifications of what we're seeing in New York City, which is that there are likely charges waiting. There are charges waiting for him if, in fact, he gets a presidential pardon. So I have to think when you factor that in and the factor that the backlash that the president is without doubt going to get if he does issue a pardon. I think that it's going to be extremely difficult, and Paul Manafort should not be expecting that anytime soon.
And the fact, Joseph, that the Manhattan DA is going to charge Manafort, is this a way to make sure that no matter what, he doesn't get pardoned, that there's still something down the road?
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a federal and a state or a locality bringing separate charges. They have absolutely every right to do that. And I like to think that even whether there was going to be a pardon or not, if the DA's office, which is an excellent office, if they feel these charges are righteous and they're supported by evidence, they would bring the charges regardless of whether a presidential pardon was on the table or not. I think it's a practical reality, though, that if for whatever reason Paul Manafort's sentence is cut short, whether through a pardon or a commutation, there are these charges waiting for him up in New York.
Paul, what do you think the significance is for Mueller's investigation in regards to Manafort at this point?
The most important thing to come out of the Manafort cases, because again, he split his case into two, in Virginia and in Washington, is the fact that he was ultimately convicted by a jury of his peers. And there were people on that jury who say they are ardent Trump supporters. They didn't want to believe Manafort was guilty, but once they saw the evidence, they believed that he was guilty of bank fraud and tax fraud, and they convicted him on many of the things that he was ultimately charged with. I think the convictions are significant because that adds validity to this investigation, even things that they've uncovered that don't speak directly to conspiracy or collusion. This is a legitimate investigation that has been vetted by a jury and found that many of the charges, though not all of them, were found to be supported by the evidence. I think that's the most important thing to come out of this. I mean, Manafort pleaded guilty, but it appeared he didn't really mean it. He didn't truly hold up his end of the bargain in terms of a cooperation with the special counsel. He has not been an ideal cooperating witness for the special counsel, but the fact that he brought forth those convictions, I think that's the most significant thing.
Joseph, I want to get your take as well.
Well, I think that that's really the big question, is what is Paul Manafort's significance with respect to the overall big picture here, right? The investigation of Russia collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. I mean, yes, Paul Manafort is now going to go to jail for his own personal crimes, but the president is not going to drop this point that says, look, no collusion has come from the Mueller investigation. No collusion came as a result of the Manafort prosecution. So that leaves all of us still wondering, what's the significance of Paul Manafort? There was clearly a reason the special counsel kept this case. There were literally thousands of federal prosecutors who could have prosecuted Paul Manafort in Virginia or in Washington, D.C. for tax and bank fraud. And yet the special counsel's office did it themselves. They clearly felt he is holding on to something that he was not cooperating about. He fell short in his cooperation agreement. He got slammed for it in D.C. So we might never really know what's in Paul Manafort's head and what the special counsel's office believed he could give them but failed to do so.
I want to ask you sort of about Judge Jackson, who mocked the defense at one point. It was actually Manafort. She went forward and said that there's no collusion. No collusion is a refrain that Manafort kept using. But she was saying that it was unrelated to the matters at hand, and this was simply a non sequitur. Paul, do you get the sense, does this undermine how the White House plans to frame this case at this point?
No. In fact, every time Manafort's lawyers go before the press after each proceeding and say something about no collusion, they're not talking to the judge. They're talking to an audience of one in the White House behind me. Every time they say that, even after a judge has said this proceeding has nothing to do with collusion or conspiracy, they'll come out, they'll talk about how there is no conspiracy, there is no collusion, that whatever had just happened was evidence of that. That's all part of an appeal to the president for a pardon. Manafort's strategy at the outset of this entire case has been to try to lobby for a pardon. No one who was well advised by his attorneys, and he has very good lawyers, would have fought those charges in Virginia. The evidence was quite significant. Most people would have entered in a plea deal, try to limit their exposure to sentencing. He fought it because he thought at the end, even if he was convicted, he'd get a pardon. He ultimately ran out of money to pursue a second trial in Washington, D.C. But again, even his plea deal, he didn't take it very seriously. His entire strategy has been to get a pardon. That's why he keeps saying no collusion. He knows that legally that has no significance in this case. It's all about appealing to the president to either get a pardon or have his sentence commuted. But with these new developments in Manhattan and the political atmosphere, it may be difficult for the president to do either.
We're going to have to leave it there. Paula Reed, Joseph Moreno, thank you both for joining us.
Sure, Rena.